All right, let's bring in Libby Evans now, the editor from the Post Millennial. Libby, great to have you with us. Thanks for coming on. You know, we've been watching these protests on behalf of Mahmoud Khalil play out, and now in the atrium of Trump Tower in Midtown Manhattan, you know, there's a very small group of people that they're speaking to right now, because most of the country, I think, doesn't want this guy here, doesn't want him agitating on behalf of a terrorist organization.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's not just a very small group of people that they're speaking to, but it's a very small group of people that are speaking. They just happen to be very loud. This is, of course, something that we learned over the past 4 years. It's a small number of people making an excessive amount of noise to get this kind of attention. Mahmoud Khalil, as the investigation is unfolding, we know that he was a spokesperson and a leader of these campus-wide chaos protests that happened last year, and that he was, I think, involved recently with, according to Caroline Leavitt in the White House, the distribution of pamphlets that were discussing the pro-Palestinian position in the war in Gaza right now in some classes and disrupting classes on campus. That's according to the White House. I don't have other verification on that. But yeah, I mean, this is a guy who came here in December 2023, got a green card rather quickly, finished his graduate degree at Columbia University in just a year, and has been living in student housing and is now being looked into by the Department of State and had his green card revoked. I think part of the issue is that a lot of these people are talking about freedom of speech and whatnot, but of course he was on a visa, so his case will have to be heard before an immigration judge, and we'll see how it all plays out, but they're certainly making a martyr out of him.
Yeah, I mean, historically, in situations like this, the courts tend to defer to the federal government. These student visas, they are issued, you know, from the State Department. They are a guest in our country, as you indicated. They are here, you know, to enjoy everything that America can provide for someone, not tear it down, which is what we've seen from Khalil. We've heard some pretty strong defenses, too, of the arrest. One from Marco Rubio, and this is border czar Tom Homan in Albany, New York, yesterday defending the arrest.
Has limitations, but when you go to a college campus, you incite protesting and locking down and taking over buildings and damaging property and handing out leaflets for Hamas, who is a terrorist organization. Coming to this country either on a visa or becoming a resident alien is a great privilege, but there are rules associated with that. You might be able to get away with that stuff under the last administration, but you won't under this administration.
I mean, it's pretty simple. I think to us, Libby, but it's obviously harder for these folks to understand.
Yeah, I mean, these are people who would be upset if we were, you know, deporting Osama bin Laden or something like that. These are people who are not just ceasefire activists, as they would like to be thought of, but these are people who are aligned with the idea that Israel should not exist. They believe Israel is a colonist nation and should have no place there. And when you look into what Khalil's organization, Columbia University Apartheid Divest, was also talking about, they were linking the war in Gaza and what they call settler colonialism with Columbia University's real estate deals in the Morningside neighborhood of Manhattan. So, you know, they really have a big stretch here. These are people who primarily hate Jews, as horrible as that is. They don't think Israel has a right to exist, and that when they say from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, what they're saying is destroy Israel, get everybody who's in Israel out of Israel, and, you know, have the people who are in Gaza take it over. It's a very violent message that they're sending here under the guise of advocating for peace.
And this is that group, Jewish Voice for Peace, and people who have seen these anti-Israeli, pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas protests sometimes have seen, you know, Hasidic Jews at these protests. This is part of that. It's one of the weird things about this whole entire situation. They are some of the loudest, most aggressive protesters. Oftentimes, they are often paid as well. But we saw yesterday, Libby, that this is a cause celeb. There's Mahmoud Khalil right there. And this has become a cause celeb. Susan Sarandon was out there yesterday. Let's take a listen to that.
Where you stand on genocide, freedom of speech is an issue, is a right that we all have. And this is a turning point in the history and the freedom of this country.
His freedom of speech. I mean, that's what they're really going with here. But, you know, and I think this is what's interesting to me, Libby, what's come out of this whole entire conversation. Most Americans realize that when you come here on a student visa and you advocate on for this type of behavior, you don't deserve a student visa and you don't enjoy the same rights that we have as American citizens.
Well, he does have a green card, so I think there are additional protections that come along with that. Although it is still a kind of visa, it's just a more permanent visa. I don't necessarily think that this is a First Amendment issue, although I do think there are concerns that when he and his attorney asked for a warrant, they were not provided one. So I think that it's important to get these things right, do them the right way, show the warrant if you have it for his arrest, deport him according to the law. That's the way to do it. But yeah, I don't agree that the freedom of speech is really an issue here, because there's a lot to be said for the fact that he and his group were inciting violence, chaos on the Columbia campus, on the Barnard campus, preventing Jewish students from going into schools, preventing them from getting to classes. And there was violence preventing Jewish students from going into the encampments on the Quad, which is right there on 116th, right? I mean, this is an area at the center of the school. It's right. That's how you access the library and many of the schools at the university. So it's completely abhorrent that that's what they did. And if he was part of that, then he should certainly have no place in the country. And Donald Trump signed the executive order saying that this would not be tolerated. I do wonder if that's retroactive, and it seems like they're enacting that executive order retroactively as well. So that's something that the 60 universities that are being investigated by the Department of Education right now for anti-Semitism should look at. That's something those students and those universities should consider. And of course, you did have Columbia saying that they would not be cooperating with the Department of Homeland Security on the enforcement of that executive order.
Yeah, and what we don't have quite yet is a response, as far as I know, from Donald Trump. The last thing he posted on Truth Social was about 30 minutes ago, talking about New York and Connecticut and pipelines for heating oil. So I'm sure he'll be briefed about this very soon, and I can only imagine what he has to say. And this obviously is a targeted protest. They're attacking Trump Tower here. Don't know how these folks all got in, although it is a public building. But we have seen in the last 30 minutes or so the police really move in and start to arrest those who refuse to leave on their own accord. They're doing it very carefully. And this is that group, Jewish Voice for Peace. They are ostensibly a pro-Jewish organization, but oftentimes they do advocate for the same things that these groups that advocate for the destruction of Israel advocate for. So that is somewhat strange to see. You know, the other aspect of this, Libby, is to see how Democrats have circled the wagons on this issue, while at the same time we still have Americans being held hostage by Hamas. They seem a lot more concerned about the release of Mahmoud Khalil.
Yeah, and that's been true this whole time, right? I mean, this is the first time they've gotten somebody here in America who they can champion the cause of. But as you said, yeah, there are, I think, 59 hostages still being held. Some of these are dead. Hamas terrorists are holding dead bodies hostage. They murdered children. They murdered pregnant women. They murdered young people. And these people occupying Trump Tower today think that the most important cause is this man who is inciting hatred of the hostages, hatred of Israel, hatred of Jews. It's absolutely out of control. And there's still an American being held as well in Gaza by Hamas terrorists. And he hasn't been released. We don't know his condition. Nobody knows what's going on there. There was a ceasefire, and even during the ceasefire, you didn't see these activists let up. They didn't seem to think that that was worthwhile. And you even saw when hostages were released, including dead bodies, right? Dead bodies of a mother and her 2 children. You saw Hamas and the people in Gaza cheering for that. They were excited about that. And these are the people who this Jewish Voices for Peace would prefer to see in ascendancy over America and people who are actually advocating for peace.
Yeah. Here's what Chuck Schumer said about these protests. He put out a statement And he says he abhors what Khalil stands for and what he has said, but he says this is a matter for the university to pursue. The Trump administration and DHS must articulate any criminal charges or facts that would justify his detention or the initiation of deportation proceedings against him. And, you know, yesterday's hearing was about the free speech issue. We heard from Tom Homan. We also have a clip here from Marco Rubio at the State Department. This is what he said about the arrests.
This is not about free speech. This is about people that don't have a right to be in the United States to begin with. No one has a right to a student visa. No one has a right to a green card, by the way.
Well, what we were talking about, too, you know, the green card, yes, gives you permanent residency here in this country. But he came in on the student visa, and the argument from the State Department and Marco Rubio and Tom Homan is he didn't live up to his end of the deal. And again, when you go back to what we're all doing now, Libby, and that's reverting back to common sense, a place of common sense, and you look at what has happened, not just at Columbia, but also at UCLA and other places, we've seen violence. So this is not a prior restraint type of free speech issue. This is cause and effect. He says these things, he participates and helps organize these protests, and then violence follows.
Yes, that's right. The other thing, too, is the revocation of a green card or a student visa doesn't have to be accompanied with a crime. The arresting officers said that they had an administrative warrant, which is different than a criminal warrant, and they don't need a criminal warrant, although the revocation of a green card does have to go before an immigration judge. So I think that, you know, we're going to see that procedure play out. As for Senator Schumer and his saying that Columbia should be looking into this, Columbia has not been looking into this. They have, you know, done a little investigating, some disciplinary proceedings, things like that. That's why Khalil had an attorney in the first place. Khalil was suspended for a brief period of time, but Columbia has done very little. They did very little to quell these protests. They did very little to keep their faculty in line when the faculty were supporting these students and saying to the students, oh, this is what we taught you in class. Walk out of class, be agitators and activists. That's what this is all about. They couldn't control the students from occupying Hamilton Hall last year. They eventually called in the NYPD, but by then it was far too late. They had already made their position clear that it was acceptable to prevent Jewish students from walking around freely on campus, and that it was acceptable to call for genocide on the campus of Columbia University, which is absolutely insane.
And one of the things I think this is a positive thing that's happening too is the interest in Columbia University from Americans is down. One of the things that is unfortunate is that a lot of these once amazing institutions have been co-opted by these foreign students, and the universities are okay with this because they pay full freight. They pay all of their tuition. You also mentioned their inability to deal with this, Columbia University. We just saw a few months ago, almost a year ago actually, the president of Columbia stepped down, Minouche Shafik, because she didn't have institutional control. And again, this isn't at Columbia, but this is what has sprung out of this. These protesters at Trump Tower now are there in support of Mahmoud Khalil, who is the Columbia University graduate student, former graduate student who's now been detained by ICE.